Show mine.
Okay, we're good.
I just hit this.
Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to today's webinar. This is Justin Kenny, Green Infrastructure Coordinator for the Ecosystem Restoration Program with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. Today's webinar is the third in a series of 5 on this particular topic of stormwater master planning, each one focusing on a different approach. So today we're looking at an approach that utilizes community-wide and site-specific modeling. Glad to be joined again today by Watershed Consulting Associates. Andres Terizo is here in the room with us. He's done the first 2, and actually today is going to be presented by Dana Allen, who also works with Watershed. Another person in the room with us today is Jim Pease, works with me in the Ecosystem Restoration Program. That's everybody here. Just a few quick notes before we start this off. Like we typically do, we're recording the webinar. We're going to post a link in the next few days on the YouTube channel. I'll send that out to folks immediately after, anybody who's registered. Attendees are muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions or technical difficulties, feel free to post them in the question box within the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Any questions that come up through that, we will ask to the presenters at the end of the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time for that. A few people have asked me for certificates for professional development hours. We don't certify those hours, but I'm happy to provide you with certificates, and you can use them to get those hours wherever you need. So if you need those, definitely email me after the webinar. I'll whip something up and get that out to you. Any other questions that come up, just ask me during the webinar, but I think that covers it for me, so I'm going to hand it over to Dana. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks everyone for attending. As Justin said, this is the third webinar here in our Stormwater Master Planning in Vermont series. This is template 2A in the guidelines, so hybrid site community scale retrofit with low impact development focus. So just as a brief overview, what we're talking about today primarily involves taking a relatively large scale, the community scale, a larger watershed, and breaking it down to the site-specific scale. So we can sort of plan for some potential hotspots within a community-wide watershed or sub-watersheds. We are going to be focusing a little bit on low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructure practices, which we'll go into a little bit. So, but first off, we're going to talk about where this might be applicable. So, who should use this template? This is actually a fairly widely applicable template across the state of Vermont. We can talk about municipalities with large and small urbanized areas and suitable on-site conditions. Large and small urbanized areas, fairly self-explanatory, anywhere from potentially downtown Burlington to a smaller area like the developed corridor in Waitsfield, which is where we're going to be primarily focusing today. But what exactly constitutes suitable on-site conditions? Primarily there for the development of green stormwater infrastructure and low-impact development, we're talking about generally good soil or soils that can allow for, be amended to allow for good infiltration, typically 1/2 inch an hour or greater is something that you strive for. Recently there's been some research coming out about how to amend soil specifically for things like clay layers or barriers of that sort. So just because the soils in a particular location aren't naturally good doesn't mean that you can't work with them to make them somewhat better for your particular project. The other thing that we like to talk a lot about here with these low-impact development practices, site-specific practices, is open space. The existence of open space makes developing these projects a lot easier. However, it doesn't have to be existing open space. In fact, as we'll see today, there was an option for what appeared to be open space, which in fact wasn't developable. And we ended up creating, or the designers rather, ended up creating some open space to build this practice. So as you're looking through these, or as you're looking through this template, ideally, open space with good soil is the perfect location. If you don't have that, though, don't necessarily write this template off as something you could use. So as far as the funding sources for this go, this is a template which, if you conform to all these model outline criteria, will meet the Ecosystem Restoration Program guidelines, so it'll be eligible for funding. The Vermont Department of Housing and Commercial Development, you'll also be eligible for those grant funds. However, since this doesn't necessarily pertain to roads and that sort of thing, Better Back Roads would not necessarily be a grant fund that you would go for. So we're just going to start by talking generally about what we mean by the site, or community to site scale process. So what do we mean when we say that? Well, first off, I wanted to give you an idea of what this is going to look like at the end. We're going to go from a relatively large area down to a very small area as we show here. And what we've got here is a medium-sized bioretention area in the middle of a large parking lot in Waitsfield. And this was actually a project that was co-developed by Stephanie Hurley at UVM, and then Watershed actually did some of the design work towards the end stages of the process and some of the operation and maintenance and that sort of thing. So what you've got is a medium-sized bioretention area that really fits the site and responds to the needs of the community. You've looked at the watershed needs, you've identified some hotspots, you've identified some priorities, you've triaged it down, and then you end up with this bioretention site, or whatever the practice happens to be, where it most needs to be. So how does this process work? Well, first off, let's just talk a little bit about low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructure. What do we mean when we're talking about this? Well, we're essentially using the toolbox that we've talked about in the past couple of webinars. It's a toolbox of design and planning techniques. And so essentially what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to disconnect impervious cover, increase infiltration opportunities, generally just reduce stormwater runoff. Because as we've seen before, what you really want is this, something that's closer to a natural condition. 10% runoff or even less potentially, a lot of evapotranspiration, and a lot of infiltration. Up to half of the water should be going back down into the ground, either shallow or deep infiltration. Because as we know from urbanized condition, when we have, say a 75 to 100% impervious cover, you're not getting as much infiltration. As little as 15% in certain conditions. This is definitely a more urbanized example here, 75 to 100% impervious cover. In Vermont, we're lucky we don't have that everywhere, so these numbers aren't exactly applicable, but we want to essentially use this toolbox to increase the infiltration, decrease the runoff. So, low-impact development essentially focuses on using natural processes wherever possible. It's not always a natural process, but what we're talking about is essentially infiltration, using soil microbial processes to remove nutrients and other pollutants such as heavy metals potentially, increasing evapotranspiration through the use of either urban tree canopies or perennial shrubs, as well as physical infiltration or physical filtration with the use of, say, vegetated level spreaders or grass buffer strips, riparian buffers, that sort of thing. These are just a few examples, though. We've talked a lot about the use of rain collection devices and stormwater chambers and that sort of thing, which aren't necessarily, natural looking. There's nothing really natural about a big plastic cistern, but that is one potential thing that you can do with LID, as well as the planning things that you can do, like street sweeping and impervious cover reduction. So they don't necessarily rely on natural processes, just providing for more opportunities for those natural processes to work. So the great thing about low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructure is that they can work in a variety of environments. So, in Vermont, we certainly have that. We've got a lot of rural areas and residential areas. And so we can do things like these vegetated bioswales or even rain collection, like these cisterns. That'll essentially allow us to collect a lot of this runoff that would otherwise make its way into the stormwater infrastructure system and then potentially negatively impact our waterways and our water bodies. But we can also use low-impact development in places like commercial areas and industrial areas. So we've got here an example of some stormwater chambers and then a fairly typical detention basin with a vegetated filter strip. These are the sorts of practices that work on maybe a scale where you can't necessarily have something like in the commercial area, you've got these underground stormwater chambers. They're not necessarily a green top, but it's still going to allow for infiltration of water, so that's how you're managing it. So the take-home message here is that this toolbox is very flexible. It's got a diversity of solutions that can be used in a lot of different environments. So when you're thinking about using this template, it's really a very applicable and flexible template for a variety of sites and for a variety of communities. So this is definitely one of the better ones in terms of being able to find a solution for almost any site. So we talk a little bit about this community to site scale. What does that mean? Well, this is essentially moving from the macro to the micro. The community, or as I kind of like to think about it, community watershed, because watersheds often transcend community boundaries. You may have to look beyond the boundaries of the municipality, which can be difficult at times, just given working with community partnerships and that sort of thing. But you really have to start at a larger scale to try to figure out what's going on in these particular watersheds, what watersheds are contributing more, runoff and potentially pollution, which ones are contributing less. So in this particular instance, we can start here. We've got this relatively large area. This is Waitsfield, the Mad River Valley, and we've got this big, long valley with a lot of complex watersheds in it. So when you start at the community scale, you've basically got to start to say, all right, how do I triage this down? How do I start breaking this into bite-sized chunks, into manageable areas? And so that's when you start to create watersheds. Here we've got the watersheds that were created for this particular model. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. But from there, you can start moving down into the site process. So essentially what we've done here, we've gone from a large scale, slightly smaller community scale, and then we're going to be able to break that information down even further, move down into the site scale. So you're moving from this massive watershed down to something maybe potentially even as small as the parking lot in the Village Square area, which is what we're looking at right here. So the first part of this process is the definition of different drainage areas. So this just makes it a little bit more manageable. So in this modeling process, essentially they created these specific watersheds. And then actually what they did is when cut them down even further. So you can see there's a straight line in the second version, this yellow line version. What happened with this particular model is that it was determined that those upper watershed reaches weren't really having as much an effect on the runoff volumes nor on the pollutant loads. So for the sake of simplicity within the model, those were taken out. Additionally, you can see in this first version, there are a lot of watersheds off to the south of the river that were initially defined as potentially being suitable for analysis. But then in this second example, you can see they're gone. And the reason for that is that if you look on this northwest side, where the yellow watersheds are currently defined, that's where most of the development is. On the other side, yes, there's some land use change. You're going from forested to an open field conditions, which can have an effect on runoff volume and potentially pollutants. But it was deemed that they weren't as important for the overall modeling process. So already the process of triage starts winnowing it down to a smaller area, to these high priority watersheds or potentially high priority watersheds. So that's what's going on there, just to explain that. It wasn't totally arbitrary. There was definitely a decision-making process there to make it a little bit more manageable. So in defining these drainage areas, and this may be review for many of you, but essentially what we're looking at here is we're looking for pour points. In this process, these initial 6 sub-watersheds that were defined and chosen were defined according to natural pour points, essentially wherever a stream emptied into another branch or into a larger stream. So you can see those arrows there are pointing to that. These sub-watersheds can also be infrastructure related or human-made. And that's often what we're going to be dealing with at the site scale, pretty much always dealing with the site scale. So in terms of the modeling and mapping process that we've outlined thus far, it's easier to look at these natural watersheds to start to break things down into smaller, more manageable units. And then once we've got them broken down into those smaller, more manageable units, then we can break them down even further by starting to look at infrastructure layers and trying to figure out what specific drainage areas really matter. So going from here, starting to look at, all right, what are the infrastructure stormwater subwatersheds? Talking about things like catch basins. They can be pour points as well. And the Vermont DEC has done a pretty good job of actually defining these for many communities. This infrastructure layer here isn't quite statewide, but for many of the communities it's available. It's generally fairly accurate, and it can be used in these modeling exercises. And there are actually a bunch of watersheds, stormwater subwatersheds, that are based on this infrastructure layer, as well as building and topography layers, that will give you a fairly good idea of what water drains to any one point. So if you are thinking about using this template within your community, trying to establish some sites, that's a very good place to start, is looking at that data and then going out and potentially verifying it to see what projects you can start doing. And sometimes we get into a hybrid of the two. So this is actually an example of where we've got a swale, the green line with the purple arrows. It's actually going into a natural channel right there. You can't see it's a fairly small natural channel running roughly east to west there. But that's actually going to have a natural and an infrastructural component. So a lot of the times you're going to see that when you're defining these drainage areas. That gets a little trickier. But you can also look at that swale as being the primary core point of concern and defining a drainage area off that. So why do we start at the community scale? Seems kind of complex. Why can't we just go out and say, find a parking lot or a building or something like that and say, all right, let's put a rain garden here. Let's put a vegetated filter strip here. You want to start at the community scale because it gives you an idea of hydrological context. Where does the water go? What flows to what? So when you're looking at this, and you're looking at all of these, chosen watersheds that you've already sort of winnowed down, you can start to say, all right, how much runoff or how much pollutant load potentially comes from each of these watersheds. So it gives you an initial cut, an initial categorization for prioritization later. Then you start to look at your infrastructure layers. Okay, so now you've got an idea of which watersheds you want to look at, how important each of them might be. Then you start to look at your infrastructure. So what infrastructure might influence a natural channel? What swales outlet to a natural channel? What pipes, catch basins and pipes outlet to a natural channel? That's going to start to give you an idea of connectivity of individual drainage areas. So if it's a parking lot that's dumping directly into a natural channel, that could potentially be an important pour point for you to define. It also allows you to start looking at these watersheds in terms of concentrated impervious areas of interest. So what do we mean by that? Well, you can see these three little circles here. This first one, pretty concentrated area of impervious. If that all goes to, say, one particular stormwater pour point or into a natural channel, then that's a directly connected area of impervious that you definitely want to pay attention to. Starting at the community scale allows you to look at that on a holistic basis. So you're really targeting things down. So you're looking for areas like this, not so much for areas like this. While there is land use change here, we've got basic residential development with associated access roads and driveways, the likelihood of that being a pollution contributor or runoff volume contributor is a lot lower than, say, an area like this, where it's almost 100% impervious, in certain areas. It also allows you to start looking for pollution hotspots. So if you know a little bit about the drainage area, if you know a little bit about the activities that go on there, you can start to say, all right, where potentially are the pollution hotspots within this watershed? What do we mean when we say a pollution hotspot? Essentially, we're looking for things like potentially heavily fertilized areas. So that could be a golf course, for example. There's usually a lot of fertilizer associated with that. Could be areas of loose sediment. Sediment gets easily transported off this surface. If it's a parking lot that's particularly near a gravel parking lot, particularly near a stream or a water body of some sort, that could definitely be a pollution hotspot area. High traffic areas. This is a pretty broad category, and one that there are a lot of different subcategories to this. So things we're talking about here could be gas stations. There's a lot of traffic in and out in addition to whatever gas might get accidentally spilled on the ground. Drive-throughs, high traffic parking lots, heavy use roads, so main roads. The main road through the town of Waitsfield, say, would be potentially a pollution hotspot just because of all the tracking that occurs with the vehicles. Side roads, smaller side roads that don't get as much traffic, maybe not as concerning as those main roads. And finally, we've got this areas directly connected to waterways. What does that mean? Well, in this case, right here, it's any area like this where you've got a lot of impervious surface really close to a waterway like this. This could potentially be directly connected to that waterway and contributing a lot of runoff directly to the water body, potentially contributing a lot of pollution. And it sort of gets into the idea of total impervious area versus effective impervious area, which is something that the state is actually developing in certain locations. And essentially, to give it a 30,000-foot view, effective impervious area is any impervious area where the runoff from that area is going directly into, say, a catch basin or directly into a natural waterway, whereas a sort of a total impervious area could be a parking lot that's surrounded by a low gradient grass area, or a parking lot separated from a stream by a large riparian buffer. Those are areas that, yes, they're impervious, they're not allowing for direct infiltration, but they're also not causing potentially as much runoff or as much pollution into water bodies. Whereas an area like this certainly could be, which could bear more investigation. So when you're starting at the community scale and trying to figure out where to go, where to put these sites, where to really look, this would be a prime example of a potential hotspot or a potential practice area. So it's the sort of thing that you want to keep in mind. So, catch up. How do you start to implement this community scale process? So I like to think of it as 3 steps, and these 3 steps are going to occur in multiple iterations. And the first one is going to be mapping. As we've seen, we sort of went from this large area, this big valley with a lot of natural waterways, some developed area, some undeveloped area, and then we started breaking it out into chunks, breaking it out into these sub-watersheds. Then we further winnowed it down. We cut out some of the watersheds where we knew we weren't as concerned. And we even cut off parts of these watersheds, as you can see with that straight line. Obviously, that's not a natural watershed feature, but knowing our model and knowing what we were really going for, we knew that taking that part of the watershed out was going to be a pretty safe bet in terms of the volume and pollutant load. So the first step you want to try is map. Get an idea of the context. Start big, and then go in smaller. Try to figure out where you really want to focus. So the next thing you do is you go out and you visit the sites. A lot of the times you'll go out and you'll visit and you'll say, all right, we've defined this particular subwatershed. Now we want to go and make sure that our boundaries are correct. That's a little bit less realistic at this larger scale. Walking all of these topographic boundaries of waterways and that sort of thing is probably unrealistic. But when you get into a smaller scale, you definitely want to start to go out and visit. Go out to ground truth your information. Go look at infrastructure. Go look at microscale variations in topography or infrastructure that could actually influence whatever your map watershed may be. If you're doing things like mapping soils data in particular locations, if you don't necessarily have good data or trust that data, you can go out and actually check out the soils and start to see, what am I really dealing with here? So getting on the ground is very important, trying to see what's there. And then finally, once you've got a pretty good idea of the mapped area, your area of interest, and you've gone out and you've ground truthed some of it, you've got a pretty good idea of what your inputs are going to be, that's when you can go back and make essentially what I'd like to think of as the first cut model. This is your first attempt at really getting down to the nuts and bolts of a particular watershed. So this part of the presentation was especially difficult for me because we talk a lot about models and modeling, and it's very difficult for me not to make jokes about models and modeling. So I promised that we're going to be talking about computer models, not male models, or any other type of models. So what are the nuts and the bolts of the map, visit, model process? Well, typically, and this is not the only way to accomplish this, but this seems to be the most effective way for most communities and most designers to do this, is using a GIS to create the main inputs. You want to try to delineate the watersheds from your topographic and your infrastructure data, stormwater infrastructure data. You want to start to get an idea of land uses, forest versus commercial land, developed land, residential, that sort of thing. And you're gathering soil data, specifically hydrologic soil groups. These are really some of the most important factors in terms of the mapping, infrastructures as well. Some of these models that we're going to discuss, you can definitely use a very high-level GIS to do this, but that's not necessarily the only thing you have to use. You don't have to use, say, Esri's ArcGIS. Some of this can be accomplished with paper maps. Some of it can be accomplished with something as simple as, say, like Google Earth. Anything that allows you to do some sort of measuring. And as we get into some of these models and explore a little bit about what other models are, what they look like, their input needs, and that sort of thing, that'll become a little more clear. But just keep in mind that a geographic information system is not a specific program. It's not a piece of software. It's a system of geographic information, maps, local knowledge, that sort of thing. You can do a lot with that within the community and even potentially the site scale. So then we talk about visiting. So a lot of the time what we're doing is we're just verifying a lot of these on-the-ground conditions, infrastructure mapping, drainage area delineations, gathering soil data on the ground, verifying what you have seen mapped but may not be 100% accurate, and getting out there and looking at some of these particular sites. And then finally, what you want to be able to do from this is just looking at, all right, how do we model this? How do we model each area, each sub-watershed for runoff volume and potentially pollutant load? And again, as we talk about a couple of these models in particular, you'll see that we can definitely model for volume with some of them and not pollutant load. We can model volume and pollutant load with other models. They all have different capabilities, so that's important to keep in mind. There is no one model. There is no one way to do this. And in fact, there may be combinations of ways to do this with models. So when we talk about these models and modeling in general, there are a couple things to keep in mind. There are three main types of models when you start to talk about stormwater management. There are hydrologic models, so essentially talking about estimating runoff volume, peak flows, and the temporal distribution of runoff. So how fast does water get from one point to another? How long is it detained somewhere? There's also hydraulic models. So that's the sort of model that estimates a water surface elevation, flow velocities, rates, discharge rates, etc., in a flow network. This is the sort of thing where you're really looking at structures, so pipes and basins and that sort of thing. That's what a hydraulic model is best for. And it usually requires inputs from the hydrologic model, which is why you'll often see them called H&H, hydrologic and hydraulic models. And then finally, we're looking at water quality models. Some of these are integrated with hydrologic and hydraulic models, but water quality models typically are focused on land use changes, BMP implementation, and how that affects pollutant loads both before and after the implementation of BMPs. So it really gives you an idea of how to estimate the pollutant reduction potential or the pollutant load associated with a particular land area, and then if you implement a particular BMP, what you might potentially reduce from that area. So these are very powerful models for a lot of different projects, especially for triaging in terms of nutrient reduction, total suspended solids reduction, etc. Within these three main types, there are also a couple different things to consider. The two primary types of models, you can either have a single event model, so that's a sort of model that takes a design storm. What I mean by design storm is a model that would account for, say, the 1-year, 10-year, and 100-year storms. For each specific geographic location, they have storms associated with them based on precipitation data and statistical analysis. So the 1-year storm, say, in Burlington is going to be slightly different than the 1-year storm in Waitsfield, and that could be the design storm for that. The state has also developed a series of regulatory design storms. So those are actually in the Stormwater Manual, and those can be used in these single event models to design for, say, the water quality volume, the 1-year and 10-year storm, that sort of thing. There's also the continuous model. These typically rely on large inputs of precipitation data for a specific area or region, and they're looking at precipitation across, say, a long time span, as much as 30 years in some models. These are particularly powerful for water quality modeling. They're going to give you the best idea of continuous wash-off, because a lot of storms are much smaller than the 1, 10-year, 100-year storms. 90% of storms are under 0.9 inches, typically. So these are best for estimating pollutant loads associated with those storms. So it's very important to understand the difference between those two. Single event, very important for certain types of sizing and design, but continuous is really important for water quality estimation. So when you're choosing a model, what are the factors that you're looking at? Well, what are you modeling for? Are you looking at volume? Are you looking at flow? Are you looking at water quality? Or do you want to do all three? So these are the questions you need to start asking yourself. So if you're just doing a volume reduction, say with the flow restoration plan, you're going to be looking at volume, you're going to be looking at flow, not necessarily water quality. It's a good thing to do, but it's not necessarily the primary focus. If you're designing smaller practices, like a lot of these low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructural practices, you're concerned with flow and volume, but you're also very, very much concerned with water quality and capturing these smaller storms. So if you are going to implement this template, that's definitely something to start considering right off the bat, is what's the most appropriate model for what I'm actually developing. And you may end up using a combination. And again, modeling for the design storm, or you modeling for long-term precipitation patterns. And again, a combination of the two may be appropriate. And finally, the other thing to keep in mind with these particular models is that a lot of them are developed for specific areas. Some of them are definitely more skewed towards urban areas, while some work better in rural areas. Some are actually pretty decent for both, but it's important to know when you're choosing this, where are you working and what's the most applicable model that you might be able to use. So there's actually a really great introductory resource to stormwater modeling, and it's under the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's website. For those of you frantically trying to write this down, this will be on YouTube. We'll be able to distribute that. You'll be able to grab it there. You can also find it very easily by Googling Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Intro to Stormwater Modeling. And that's actually a really great resource to start to break down just what are all these models, what do they do best, what do they require from the user. And in fact, they put out a great table. This is actually a dynamic table. You can start to look at, all right, I'm looking for a water quality model. Which one should I look at? Or I'm just looking for a combined hydraulic and hydrologic model. Which one should I look at? What are the sort of inputs necessary, that sort of thing. Because they break it down in terms of input complexity. Do they do continuous modeling, so that long-term precipitation modeling? Or is it more just a more of a design storm, discrete events? They also tell you whether they're free or not, which is quite nice. And And then they give you also the type of water quality model, and you can actually link to individual descriptions of each of these. So that's actually quite helpful. And that's at this website right here. Again, if you go to that main page, you can get to this table fairly easily. This will be on the recorded webcast YouTube afterwards, so you can pause it there and snag it from that website. So just to briefly talk about some of these, some of the more common ones you may see out there. We've got 5 different ones we're going to talk about, and the first one we're going to talk about here is HydraPad, primarily because HydraPad is such a common model. It's a combined hydrologic and hydraulic model. It's used a lot for regulatory compliance with the unified sizing criteria, which has been adopted by a lot of stormwater manuals in Vermont as well. So what is it particularly good for? Well, again, it's one of those design storm models where it's good for discrete events. This is really good for sizing of practices, figuring out, potentially ponded area in a bioretention area or a basin. It works pretty well in urban and rural environments, so it's fairly flexible. And as I mentioned, it's used for regulatory compliance. It's not particularly good for pollution modeling. There's no built-in pollutant modeling here. You could potentially use it, sort of looking at volume and volumes reduced and that sort of thing, but again, it's not built in to the model itself. So doing that requires a lot of user input and potentially a lot of user error, so it's not often really used for that. And it's not good for continuous precipitation simulation. So it's really just for those larger, quote-unquote, extreme storms. You can enter smaller design storms, but again, not really its strength. That's not really what it's designed for. But it can be quite good, as we'll see a little bit later here, when used in conjunction with other models. Another very common model is EPA's Swim Model. This is really good for urban environments. That's primarily what it was developed for. There is some rural application as well, but keep in mind that if you're working in primarily a rural area, this is not going to be maybe your first choice. It will do both hydraulic, hydrologic, and water quality modeling. And there are green stormwater infrastructure practices already built in. So you can essentially plug in certain practices with known reduction values, at least statistically known reduction values, and get an output that sort of tells you what your pollutant reduction is going to be. So again, it does the design storm, the continuous precipitation modeling, and perhaps most importantly, it is free. The one caveat with Swim is that it's not maybe the easiest to use. Because it does so many things, there is a relative level of complexity to the inputs, medium to high. So that can be a bit of a barrier to entry for some users.
And just to add one thing to the Swim, a really nice new tool is the EPA Stormwater Calculator, which is a Swim-based tool, which is a boiled-down version. It runs Swim, but it's a boiled-down version, which is if you Google EPA Stormwater Calculator, it's a really nice planning tool, and there's ways to use to evaluate LID projects with that tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So the next one, and this just sort of illustrates how many stormwater models there are out there, and how easy it is to find a lot of different models to respond to different situations, and a lot of different models that respond to sort of user experience. So again, when we talk about stormwater modeling, there's a large diversity in terms of what we can use to actually accomplish site selection coming down from these larger areas. So this is another one, the P8 model, the program for predicting polluting particle passes through pits, puddles, and ponds. We're going to have a contest to see who can say that the fastest. Primarily the reason I mentioned this one is that it serves as the basis for the Vermont BMP DSS model, the best management practice design or decision support system. That particular program in Vermont is currently being used for flow restoration planning. So many of you who may be participating in that process now, this is the basis for that. So it's primarily an urban environment model. It does continuous precipitation modeling, pollutant loading modeling, as the name suggests, particulates particularly. And there are several built-in BMP types, so that does make it somewhat easier to evaluate BMP usage. So it's not necessarily great for design storm modeling. In fact, I think that oftentimes that has to be supplemented with HydraPad for a certain sizing criteria and modeling. GSI practices, there are some built in, but things like pervious pavement, that's not something that it models particularly well. And it is a relatively complex model, so this is not the sort of thing you can just jump into very easily, but it is out there for a lot of these other practices. And one of the last ones we're going to talk about in terms of modeling, and this is the model that was used for this particular project in Waitsfield that the template is based on, is SLAM for Windows, often known as WinSLAM, the source loading and management model. This is primarily it's an urban-rural model, but it's definitely more skewed to urban environments, so using it in a developed core is more appropriate than using it, say, in a residential area. It models for continuous precipitation. It picks up pollutant loading modeling. And what's interesting about SLAM, which is different from a lot of other models, is it's based on field observation. So actual tested values, wash-off values from some of these particular land use types. And we'll get into how SLAM separates those out. But that's the interesting thing to keep in mind here, is that this is based on actual values, not just theoretically, statistically proven values. Not to say that these other models with theoretical or statistical value models are invalid. It's just that this one can be more accurate for certain types of land use. It also integrates green stormwater infrastructure as well as low-impact development. So again, what do we mean by low-impact development? It's a whole toolbox, not just structural but non-structural practices. So you can actually model things like street sweeping in it, which is fairly unique in the modeling world. So what is it really not good for? Again, design storm modeling. It doesn't do those specific discrete events. So in that sense, it's maybe not as useful for compliance. It's not necessarily good for small site-specific practices. The way it's particularly well used and the way it's used here is as a planning level tool. So looking at a large area, the community, those larger watersheds, and then being able to triage down into what watersheds are the most important, what source areas are the most important. And it's definitely not good for hydraulic analysis, things like pipe sizing. In fact, they specifically warn against that. That would be more of a HydraCAD sort of tool. And then the last one I wanted to talk particularly about is just the simple method, and then the way that can be implemented, particularly in Vermont. The simple method is essentially a way of looking at a particular area of land and developing what's called a runoff coefficient, or how likely water is to run off that surface. It's essentially based on the impervious coverage of a particular land area, just turned into a coefficient. Then you can get runoff in terms of inches based on precipitation. And this calculation here actually says PF, or the fraction of rain events that produce runoff. You don't always have to use that. You can sometimes skip that part. But then you multiply that by your runoff coefficient developed in the first part, and you can get a runoff value in inches. And you can actually do pollutant loading in this. If you want to take it one step further, if there's a known concentration of a runoff or in the runoff coming from a particular land area, but that's not as common. It's typically used more as a volume-based calculation. And the DEC has actually developed a Excel worksheet that essentially does this calculation for you. So it's very simple to use. Again, it's Excel spreadsheet based, so anyone running Excel or a similar spreadsheet program can use this very easily to essentially get a water quality volume.
Just to clarify one thing here on the slide, so the simple method is an empirical tool, spreadsheet tool, which is used to calculate loads of pollutants, and then the spreadsheet below, the water quality volume, that's just a shortcut method to calculate the volume generated during the water quality storm, which is the 0.9-inch storm. So that's the volume-based equivalent, which is typically thought of as the volume that would be targeted for treatment, equivalent to the 0.9-inch storm. Whereas the simple method is in fact used to calculate pollutant loading, and it's based on average concentration values for various land uses. So it's really a rough cut model, but it is used quite a bit in Vermont, and it's used during the regulatory process for assessing various pollutant loads to determine, basically to offset pollutant loads generated during development. And it's a popular method because it is quite easy, but you are, one of the drawbacks to the method is you're really you're assuming a lot when you're assigning just a broad brush event mean concentration value for a certain land use, say grass or pavement. You're assigning just a broad brush number. So really, the simple method, you're getting the same results as, say, with WindSlam, but I think WindSlam is taking a much more complex look at the process of the pollutants generated on the surface and then flowing to the stream, and all the microprocesses that are happening as the pollution travels through the watershed. Whereas with the simple method, it's more of just a one-step spreadsheet calculation tool. But it does have its applicability simply because it's relatively easy to use, and it's relatively well known in Vermont. So
yeah, and just another note on this particular spreadsheet shown here, it's the volume calculation. There is a flow-based calculation, but just a caveat, this is just for water quality volume. And that can be found on the Watershed Management website. So again, that'll be available in the YouTube broadcast. So don't feel like you need to write that down.
I can send those links out in the email too.
Yeah, that'd be great. So now that we've sort of looked at a few of these different options, for this particular template for the bioretention and waste field, the designers used a combination of the WindSlam model and the HydraPad model. And as we sort of get into this a little bit, we'll see why that is. But this is a pretty common practice to use a combination of models to sort of start to get at what are the benefits of a particular practice in a particular location. So we're going to start to look at specifically how this project was implemented. So we're going from idea to reality, and this is the map visit model approach made real, essentially. So we're looking at that WindSlam HydraPad combination, all right? How are we going to use that here? So we look at this, we look at WindSlam in terms of how is it different from, say, other models. Many runoff models focus on the larger, more rare events. These are definitely important. They cause significant problems like flooding, things like erosion, road collapse with those larger, more intense rainstorms. And while these are definitely serious water quality problems, they're only part of the issue. They're the problems associated with large storms. There's a lot of pollutant wash-off that occurs in smaller, more frequent storms. So let's try to get at that. What are these? So WindSlam focuses on these common, smaller rain events. That's where it really becomes important for designing low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructural practices. So those smaller storms contain the first flush of pollutants, things that have accumulated over time on the surface of the land or on roofs and that sort of thing, that are then flushed off into the into the stormwater infrastructure. So we're talking about things like sediment, which can contain bound nutrients, particulate or dissolved nutrients, again, often bound up in sediment. Oil and gas residues, heavy metals off roofs and that sort of thing that may have been deposited out of the atmosphere. So these accumulate during rain-free periods, and these small storms come through and flush these into the catch basins or streams. So Windslam is able to get at these pollutant loading estimates in a very systematic way. So that's why they use it here. So it's a really good, this Windslam and HydraPad combination is a really good way at getting at, all right, what's the pollutant load associated with these smaller storms? And then using HydraCAD, as we talked about, that's a hydraulic and hydrologic model. You can start to look at what are the larger storms, what are these design storms, how much volume is expected to be generated during these, and use the combination of these two to use Windslam to prioritize a watershed and use HydraCAD to then size the green stormwater infrastructural practice at a particular location. How much water can you expect in the larger storms? How much of it might you be able to retain? How much of it might be able to infiltrate? So it's a really good combination for green stormwater infrastructure. Essentially allows us to triage sites down to priority, model those small storm pollutants, and then size the GSI practice. So this, I think, is really one of the most powerful aspects of Windslam is how does it prioritize? How can we use models to prioritize these stormwater projects? So again, the first thing we do is we start with these 6 subwatersheds, breaking it into smaller bite-sized chunks. So from those subwatersheds, we then start to classify them into source areas. Windslam has a number of different source areas, so roofs, driveways, streets, etc. Why does it do this? Why would we be concerned about this? Well, obviously a roof has a different potential pollutant load than a driveway. Roofs, typically you're not seeing sediment. You're not seeing a lot of tracking from vehicles, obviously. You're seeing atmospherically deposed pollutants, things like heavy metals, sometimes NOx and SOx compounds that will sit on that roof that during a rainstorm will get washed off. You're not necessarily seeing the same sort of sediment or maybe phosphorus load you'd be seeing from a gravel parking lot. Why split out driveways versus streets? Well, driveways and streets have very different traffic loading capabilities. So driveways, typically lower volume. Typically you're not going to see as much tracking. You're not going to see as much debris on them. So they will contribute differently in terms of pollutants, whereas streets, higher traffic, more things falling, potentially out of vehicles or, falling off vehicles, tracking from dirt roads, tracking from dirt driveways into the roads. So those are going to have a slightly different runoff coefficient, or pollutant coefficient rather. Slightly different than paved parking. Again, parking tends to be a little bit lower traffic. The pollutant loads are lower there, or different anyway. And then you start to think about, well, what's undeveloped land? And essentially Windslam looks at undeveloped land as land that's in natural conditions. So typically in Vermont you're talking about forested land, land that can take quite a bit of water and not generate that much runoff. It can also be open areas such as meadows and that sort of thing if that's a naturally occurring condition. And again, we'll notice back here with this slide, that line up there, they kind of cut those watersheds off, and it's because that most of the land up in that area is quote-unquote undeveloped land. Yes, there is some open field, but for the most part, it was deemed to be not as important because it's undeveloped. So that doesn't contribute as much in the Windslam model in terms of its runoff or in terms of its pollutant load. So that was the rationale for cutting off those watersheds. So then finally you get into this last category, and there are actually several other categories. We just broke it down into these basic ones for this particular study. But the landscaped areas, and these are any areas like lawn, garden, golf courses, any sort of open area that's not in its natural condition that's also not impervious. So that's how you start to break down these areas. It gives you an idea of these pollutant source areas. So then once you've done this, then you can start running the model for particular subwatersheds. And so you can do stuff like contrast the percent runoff or percent runoff volume for different watersheds. So here we've got subwatershed 1, for example. On the left-hand side there you see in orange, That's the percent runoff from residential land uses within that subwatershed. And on the left-hand side in red there, that larger bar that goes up to 35%, that's the percent runoff from commercial land uses in that watershed. So those values are assigned for each of these subwatersheds. So looking at subwatershed 1, we can start to go, all right, there's a lot of water coming off commercial land uses within subwatershed 1. That's potentially a watershed we want to start to look at. That's got a lot of water coming off potential hotspots, potential large impervious areas. So this is where you start to actually get into the nuts and bolts of triaging down and figuring out which subwatershed you want to focus on. Subwatershed 6, on the other end of the graph, not as much water coming off it generally, and not as much water coming off commercial land use. In fact, it's more residential. Probably not as high a priority. So this is sort of the first cut. So then we can start to break it down even further. So we just looked at subwatersheds and some general categories of runoff. Now we can start to look at percent runoff compared to the percent area of watershed. So what are we talking about here? Well, we've essentially got two bars. The blue bar, that's water. That's the percent runoff. The red bar is the percent area of watershed. So for each of these source areas, you've got street area 2, street area 1, commercial land use. For each of those areas, the blue bar, the percent runoff, is much more than you would necessarily expect from the percent area of the watershed. So it's a relatively small area contributing a relatively high volume of water. So that starts to maybe pull a trigger in your mind and say, all right, what's going on here? Why are these contributing so much more volume than they're making up in terms of the total area? Are they directly connected to impervious? Is there a particularly high runoff coefficient for these source areas? So that allows you to then go back to your map and look at, say, street area 2 and start to evaluate, all right, what does that exactly encompass? What is it connected to? And is there any opportunity potentially to do anything here? So this is just, again, getting down to a finer and finer scale, moving from that large-scale community down to this is almost site-specific at this point, depending on how you map it. Again, it depends greatly on the inputs. But this is starting to get down to where you can actually select specific sites for your practices. So like we were just talking about again, you know, all right, maybe street area 1, maybe that's that particular area. It's actually a parking lot. We're just using this for illustration purposes. But looking at that street area 1, all right, is that somewhere we're concerned about? What's under there? Is there an area to do something with? You know, there's some open space next to it. Potentially, if this is actually contributing that much runoff, maybe that's some place we can work in. Same with commercial land use there on the west side there. That's potentially another spot that you could do some sort of practice in. You know, so this just basically lets you get down to a finer and finer scale to start planning these particular practices. So finally, you've come from the community scale, you've broken it into these smaller pieces, you've finally gotten down to these critical source areas where you've identified, all right, there's a lot of runoff coming off from this one small area. Let's actually do something. Let's try to make this project real. So you've prioritized, you've got your list of potential projects. So this is, in a way, I feel bad about this slide because we spent so much time talking about modeling and prioritization. This is oftentimes the hardest part of any of these projects where you've finally identified a site. Now you can actually try and go and make it real. So you've identified your priority source areas. You've identified the ownership of the land here. You've identified some of the costs associated with implementing this project. If it's feasible, you proceed with the design. If not, at least you've got the information. You've got these priority sites for future potential use. So in terms of the project in Waitsfield that this template is based on, we'll go back to this picture. This is the bioretention area. And so based on Stephanie Hurley's study, the prioritization, this particular area, the Village Square area, was found to be a particular hotspot for runoff. It's a large impervious area. There are a lot of catch basins they're going directly into a swale that then outlets into the Mad River. So they knew that it was a potential problem site. They knew that there was a potential solution there. In looking at the area, you can kind of see in the background of that picture there's a large green space. And so there was an open space that had been identified. However, on a subsequent site visit, it was found that that space was actually a leach field, wasn't it? So essentially, that was ruled out. So it was almost back to the drawing board. It was almost like, all right, nothing's going to happen here. That open space is unfeasible. But again, like we were talking about before, it doesn't necessarily have to be open space. If you've got the willing, property owner, and in this case they did, to take away a few parking spots, I think it was 6 parking spots, and to put in a bioretention practice that's both aesthetic and functional right in the middle of this parking lot. They were amenable to that, and so essentially with a relatively small amount of work to get drainage to go into this bioretention practice, they were able to site it right in the middle of the parking lot. You can see there are some concessions made to both protection of the practice as well as to the protection of the garden with those rain guardian inlets to prevent scouring in the garden. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's definitely a lot of flow that potentially goes into this garden, and so there was a safety overflow that was designed in. And that's where a program like HydraPad becomes more important. The designers were able to size it to essentially pond up a certain amount of water before overflowing into that overflow pipe. And that pipe was designed in there so that the garden wouldn't just overflow onto the parking lot and back up and be a nuisance. So essentially, that's the relief valve. Windslam, maybe not the best model for doing that particular part of the design. So modeling that ponding, modeling that overflow. That's where the combination of Windslam and HydraCAD really comes into play. Windslam prioritizes it, triages it down to important sites, and then HydraCAD can essentially size the practice most effectively so as not to take up too much space within the parking lot.
Can I add one thing since
Yes.
we're talking about that? So obviously with any model, it can be imperfect. So there were actually areas that came out as high priority in the model, but as Dana said, there's this effective impervious area versus impervious area. So anything that came out as a high priority in the model, we went out and did a field visit to determine whether or not that source of pollutant was actually getting to a waterway. And there were a number of high priority sites that when we looked at them, there was essentially no discharge. There was either a buffer or a grass swale or something already in place. So those sites were ruled out. But that bioretention in Waitsfield, that was a perfect one. It was obvious. There was a catch basin. All the water from the parking lot was going to that. It was a high priority site, so it was kind of a no-brainer.
Well, and thanks for bringing that up too, because that kind of gets back to the whole map visit model iterative process. You model it, you spend a lot of time mapping and modeling, and then you go out in the field and you find out, well, actually, the computer said so, but it wasn't totally true. So that's a very critical part of this process, is actually going on site and seeing, is it really indeed a problem? Computer modeling can only tell you so much. So that's really, in my mind, one of the most critical parts of the process. And it may take a few models and it may take a few visits to really winnow it down. Mm-hmm. So it's not a one-time thing. Yeah. So that's essentially the end of this template. This template doesn't necessarily meet all the model outline criteria. That's not in any way a bad thing in terms of this model. It just means that it doesn't technically meet all the criteria that are outlined within the Stormwater Master Planning Guidelines. So the criteria that it doesn't necessarily meet are problem definition. While it is to some degree defining a problem, pollutant loading associated with particular land areas, it's not a water body based problem. So it's not something that was defined necessarily in the Mad River and then, looking at potentially like a pollution problem within the Mad River, like nutrient pollution, and working back from there. This is more looking at the land area loading. So it's a bit of a gray area for sure. While it does define a problem, it's not necessarily like the holistic problem definition. As far as existing data collection, it relies on existing data, but typically with the stormwater master planning process, you're looking at gathering essentially a library of data for any watershed or community. So you're looking at things like stream geomorphic assessment. You're looking at things like macroinvertebrate studies, any other stormwater modeling studies that have been done. So this particular study looked at a lot of existing data, used a lot of existing data, but didn't necessarily assemble it into a multi-purpose library. It just collected the data it needed to accomplish this. So again, a bit of a gray area, but technically with the stormwater master planning process, you're looking for that library, that holistic catalog of data that could be used on a number of different projects, essentially into the future. So yes, it definitely created some new data, so it fulfills that requirement. As far as program evaluation, both existing and proposed, while it does provide a list of priority projects for the future, it doesn't necessarily make holistic recommendations in terms of, say, adopting zoning practices, low-impact development practices. It essentially looks at where are the problem sites within Waitsfield, in this community, and how do we solve them? So again, this is a very good study. This is a very good design and modeling exercise, and it's a good template to use. It just doesn't technically meet the holistic guidelines of the stormwater master planning process. It does come up with summary and recommendations in the form of that prioritized list of projects and potential project sites for the future. So finally, I guess it came to our attention that we'd given you a bad link for an older version of the Stormwater Master Planning Outlines. So this is that updated link, and Justin, I think you probably already sent that out with the past webinar.
It might have been the old link.
Maybe.
But
I think we corrected it for the one 2 weeks ago, but this is the updated link. So definitely use this set of master planning guidelines, not the older one. And that concludes our webcast today regarding site and community scale retrofits with low impact development.
great. So if folks have questions, definitely send them in while we're waiting for those. Couple things. Reminder, session is recorded. It's going to go on the YouTube channel. I'll send out a link to anybody that registered. The next webinar in the series is Thursday, October 30th. It's going to focus on traditional end-of-pipe management, so sign up for that if you haven't yet. And that is the day before Halloween, and I will certainly be wearing a costume.
Oh, cool.
Nobody will see it, but I'll be wearing a costume. If you have any follow-up questions after the webinar, send them to me. If you have any feedback, we've gotten a little bit, and everyone's like, hey, these webinars have been great, so that's good. Feedback, critical or not, definitely send it along. We'll try to make some adjustments. We do have a question here. Oh, Michael was asking, can you send the Minnesota link out via email? Yes, so I'll send that out. I'll send the link out to the Vermont worksheets that were shown as well, and I'll also send the link out to the Stormwater Master Planning Guidelines and make sure that that is the newest version of those. So I'll send all of those links out with the link to the YouTube. You're welcome, Mike. And I don't see any more questions at this point. Any other follow-up thoughts from either of you or you, Jim?
I don't think so.
I feel like I talked enough. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, well, it looks like that's good. So thank you, folks, for signing on. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Jim. We'll see all of you in about 2 weeks. Take care.